Ladies and gentlemen, the session is about to start. Please take your seat.
Well, welcome. Thank you for being here. We'll start our panel on disinformation. And as a journalist, of course, this is the most important topic at the moment, especially thinking about war in Ukraine, but also all the other conflicts. I mean, information is usually seen as the first victim. But as you know, I mean, disinformation doesn't only afflict journalists. It does afflict governments, it influences decisions that have been taken, it influences also elections. And I will immediately introduce our speakers. Mark Owen Jones, Assistant Professor of Middle East Studies at the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha in Qatar. Alessandro Corsi, Senior Analyst, Social Media and Conflict of International Crisis Group with a long experience at the European Union. Bayan Tanal, Communication and Media Specialist from Jordan, and Tamara Kharroub, Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow, Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. And I will start with Professor Jones, who has just published as well a book on disinformation. And, well, would you give us the outline, especially in the MENA region? I mean, how does it afflict the region? How big is it seen as a problem? And where are where is it most critical according to you? According to your, I mean, you have been following disinformation for quite some time, especially in the region where it's very sensitive.
Yes, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for coming. So most of my work focuses on the Arab-speaking world, but I look in particular at digital disinformation in the MENA region. And I acknowledge that it's a huge problem in the Middle East. And when you ask people, is it a big problem? Of course, the answer is yes, but I think there has been a tendency to focus on disinformation as being produced by Russia, China, and people, by doing so, are actually missing the fact that one of the biggest problems we have is disinformation in the Middle East region. And I don't mean that it's just confined to the region. What we have to understand about disinformation is it's transnational and it's global, and that countries that use disinformation will use that in order to be aligned with their own foreign policy, which transcends borders and attempts to influence publics outside the geographical jurisdiction. So I just want to give a bit of an outline about the Middle East, and in particular the Arabic-speaking world, because that's a region that covers 23 to 25 countries. It's a large region in particular. So what I argue in my book, really, is that one of the most important things to acknowledge at the moment in the digital space is that we have emergent digital media superpowers in the Middle East. These are primarily Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. These two countries are resourcing disinformation to a degree that other countries probably aren't putting the same capacity into. And there's a reason for this. There's a normative reason. They're rich, they're wealthy, they have a high technology penetration rates. But also, we're seeing a crucial moment in the Middle East where Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman and UAE under Mohammed bin Zayed are trying to position themselves as very influential actors in the regional space. And so what we've seen over the 10 years, particularly after the Arab Spring, the Arab Spring was a wake-up call for traditional authoritarian regimes who then realized that they had to resource means of counter-revolution. One of these means of counter-revolution was the information space, because as everyone knows, 10 years ago, the idea of social media, it would be a liberating tool that would help opposition movements to try and overthrow authoritarian regimes. And so governments got wise to this. And so I'll just finish by giving a couple of examples in terms of quantitative sense of what these countries are doing. We know, for example, in terms of Twitter, which is a very open and penetrated platform, it's very easy for bad actors to manipulate it. Saudi and the UAE are probably the third highest manipulators of Twitter in the world, after China and I believe Iran. These are at least from the data that Twitter has published, which, by the way, is not comprehensive, and we should not treat that data as being representative of the problem, because, as I'm sure my fellow panelists will talk about, social media companies should not be trusted. And we've seen, I think an important thing to bear in mind is to actually reflect on what these countries have demonstrated to us in terms of their focus on disinformation. And many of you probably have read that a few months ago, an American court, for example, found a former Twitter employee guilty of conspiring with Saudi Arabia to infiltrate Twitter and pass sensitive information about Saudi-based Twitter users back to members of the royal court in Saudi Arabia. So what this shows to us is that people within the Saudi government themselves view social media as a threat, and they are resourcing attempts to actually try and infiltrate that space in order to counter oppositional movements. Now, this is not necessarily an exclusive tactic to those regimes. Most, I think, many government intelligence agencies would try to get close to Facebook and Twitter. But we have evidence that the UAE and Saudi are resourcing this in particular. And their influence operations extend across the Arabic world. And whenever there's any sort of significant political event outside the Gulf region in particular, let's say what happened in Tunisia, the auto coup, we see Gulf-based narratives dominating the online space. So if you, for example, reading something about Tunisia on social media, you're more likely to see a Gulf narrative aligned with, say, Saudi or the UAE than you are to see a narrative coming from within the country. So my overall opening statement is that disinformation is a big problem in the region, particularly on social media, Western social media platforms, and that at the moment we're seeing the UAE and Saudi being some of the dominant actors in this space.
Just a short follow-up question. I mean, you outlined a picture where, I mean, the governments, the regime, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, they are deeply interested in occupying a space in social media and like this forwarding their own policies and influencing people. And well, of course, I think also Qatar does that.
Yeah, of course.
Well, all governments tend to do
but then
that.
so does Bahrain, Oman, you know.
Yes, they all do that. But what is the role, I mean, how does independent media try to, if there is, because I mean, especially in Saudi Arabia, I know of people who have been put into jail because of a tweet. Right. And, well, it resounds in the West, but then what happens in the countries?
Well, I think this is an important aspect of you know, digital authoritarianism, which is the use of digital technology to facilitate authoritarian rules, is that it doesn't take much to actually have a chilling effect. You only have to imprison one person for 32 years for tweeting something to make everyone else in that place feel like that they shouldn't tweet something. And I think most countries in the Middle East technically are authoritarian, with very few exceptions, especially in the Gulf. And these are regimes that traditionally don't tolerate any criticism. And so those people who are made examples of, it's an efficient way of trying to silence other people. So we have to really ask ourselves the question, how effective is social media as a tool of dissent if it's being appropriated as a tool of control?
Well, now I want to go over to Europe with Alessandro Accorsi. Now you work for the International Crisis Group, but you have got long experience with the European Union. So, I mean, Europe has been also approving various laws, regulations, trying to, what Jones was saying before, that, I mean, the superpowers of the big multinationals, Twitter and so on, that are on the social media platforms. So Europe is trying somehow to counter their power. Could you give us first an overview on this information disorder and what is Europe's role, and then we will get into the Middle Eastern more specific detail.
Yes. First of all, thank you again for inviting me here. as you said, I worked in the European Union for the past 6 years, and I've been part of the efforts to set up these ways of working on disinformation, especially in the MENA region. First of all, understanding what it is, what the problem is, and then trying to find solutions. It is quite interesting because disinformation has become, over the past few years, I think the second largest thematic priority for the European Union after climate change. It really informs a lot of the policy initiatives, a lot of efforts are going into ways of tackling disinformation. It is seen as an existential threat to Europe. Interestingly enough, as it often happens with the European Union, it was defined more by an external threat, because the European Union itself cannot really look inside the European Union and what's happening at member state level. So it all started with Russia. Russia was the big actor, the big scare. And in 2015, that's when the first task force was established to counter Russian disinformation and work on the issue. But from there, there's been an evolution. There's been more understanding of the problem. There have been resources that have been allocated. But I think it's quite interesting that Europe's response and interest in the disinformation problem is shaped by the neighborhoods. And that happened before the Ukraine war, the Russian aggression on Ukraine, but the Russian aggression of Ukraine has even accelerated even further this move to actually take disinformation seriously. There are two main problems, I would say, that the view from the European Union. The first one is that disinformation is a democratization problem for democratic societies in Europe, but also a democratization process in the wider neighborhood, because it creates instability. Polluted information environment where debates cannot happen publicly and freely are a problem. If you have a country where dissent cannot be expressed, or where everything is just kept down, it will explode. And disinformation creates a huge problem of polarization of views in society, radicalization. So it fosters instability even further. So that is one problem. The second problem is also from a human rights point of view and a freedom of expression point of view, which I think it's quite interesting because the European Union, this is quite a peculiar actor. By its own constitution, it has a foreign policy that is dictated by interest, the interest of different member states and of the Union itself, but also by values. It is in the European Union's treaties that Europe has to promote certain values: democracy, human rights, freedom of expression, etc., etc. So it's interesting because the approach to countering disinformation is taking into account also the need to balance freedom of expression, protection of human rights activists, of civil society, with security interests or economic interests, unlike other actors. But then, if we want to be cynical and not care about what happens to human rights activists and civil society and everything, it is clear that disinformation presents, especially in the MENA region, a direct threat to Europe as a security threat. The first one, it creates instability. We see places like Libya, where the Tripoli offensive was not just a military offensive. It was there was a low-intensity conflict, but also another proxy conflict happening on social media, on the digital space, that was playing out directly and having consequences on the ground. It was making any ceasefire more difficult to achieve. It is used, disinformation is used, as Mark was saying, by countries in the region, outside the region, but also by non-state actors. Let's think of ISIS, for example, and other terrorist groups, to meddle in the situation of other countries, influence their political situation, further enhance instability in a country. And there are a lot of countries in the region that are in control of their own information environment. They don't want to see another 2011 happening, but there are a lot of other countries that are very fragile and they're very open to external influences. And what's going on right now is that the region is a fertile ground for proxy conflicts and for low-intensity conflicts happening in the digital space that could easily spill over into actual violence and conflict. And then there's another point that is the policy space. Disinformation is not only used as a tool of influence or of fighting these proxy wars or controlling a space, but it is also used as a tool of negotiation in policy exchanges, in what's going on. We've seen that from the European Union perspective, certain states negotiating something with Europe or on certain positions, using, for example, disinformation or information manipulation as a tactic to push certain narratives and then lead to certain changes. If we look at Syria, Russia's playbook on disinformation in the Syrian context has the fact that some of the policy positions that Europe held or the West held for a long time are not feasible anymore. Same thing happening in other contexts. So disinformation can also be used to close a space policy-wise for policy initiatives to take place, because at the end, policy cannot work. Any policy cannot work if it's not linked to communication, to good, effective communication, if there is no support and if there are no conditions on the ground for that policy to be actually implemented. And so disinformation is used to close out Europe also from this space, which is a threat, but it also now becoming, the downside of all of this is that because Europe started looking at it from the Russian perspective, I spent 5 years trying to warn with Mark about other superpowers appearing.
Now, in fact, I wanted to ask you, I mean, if now the war in Ukraine, I mean, disinformation is almost daily, and I would say from both sides, and how does, as you said, disinformation, well, brings to extreme polarization, and what is more extreme than during a war. So what are the tools that are available in Europe to de-escalate this kind of violence in this social space, because it's being occupied in a very, very violent way, and always more so. So where do you think that this will lead to, and what are the tools that Europe is trying to give itself, and are they effective?
Europe as one superpower, as some of my former colleagues called it, which is the regulatory power. It's the largest market in the world. So by regulating digital markets or markets in general for consumers' protection, think of the USB-C charger for your phone. The whole world will have the same charger because the European Union decided that it's better for consumers to have just one type of charger. And that applies to the whole world. So the regulatory power of the EU is that it's such a large market that when it decides to regulate something, that those rules will apply to the rest of the world. So far, the problem with regulating social media and disinformation has been that there have been two approaches that have been taken. One is state-mandated regulations, which is a problem because every state, every country can define the problem in a different way. What is a terrorist organization to me might not be a terrorist organization to someone else. What is hate speech to me might not be to someone else. And that creates a lot of problems. It infringes on freedom of expression, free speech, et cetera, et cetera. The other side has been, oh, let's leave the social media platforms to regulate themselves. That led to, for example, some of the first definitions like coordinated and authentic behavior being actually proposed by companies like Facebook. But at the same time, it's linked to their willingness to invest, which is very little in finding solutions. So how do you find a balance between these two approaches? And how do you find a balance between the need to regulate and de-escalate a problem, and on the other side, freedom of expression? What Europe tried to do is to pass the Digital Service Act, which is, in my view, a smart way of trying to put users' interest and not state interest or social media platforms' interest at the center, and try to have some standards that social media companies have to follow without being too strict on them, without dictating them. But like, it's more about like, this is a problem, like you shouldn't sell data of users, for example, and it's up to you to find a solution to this. And that is a smart way of trying to find a balance, a thin balance between freedom of expression and disinformation. Disinformation is here to stay, it will not go away. But too often, one of the easy fixes that it's proposed is to crack down on freedom of expression. And that cannot be a solution.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, rules, regulations need that people put them into practice, know about them, and are aware. And here I come to our third guest, Bayan Tal, of the communication and media specialist from Jordan. And the Jordan Media Institute has been working exactly on this, on alphabetizing users, how to recognize disinformation, what to do. So is it working? And I mean, is that the answer, or could that be the answer? But it is probably a slow answer because it takes time.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've been invited to so many conferences, and all the sessions are on disinformation, misinformation, and now they're introducing it into every symposium. And I think that's a very healthy sign. The thing is, we're constantly discussing disinformation, but we're not really addressing the issues behind disinformation. What makes disinformation spread so fast? Why is it so effective? And it's different from one community or one nation to another. And it has a lot to do with the dynamics of that community, how much space there is for people to express themselves, how literate or educated that community is, the flow of information and the right to access information also has a lot to do with that. The mentalities of that community is also related to how much they consume disinformation. And so we need to understand how that happens and then draft the solution. And the solution has been there for many years, especially in Europe. Many European states had started introducing media and information literacy into schools at a very early age. And it has to be, of course, we have to adapt because, as Alessandro said, disinformation is here to stay. And those who spread disinformation are becoming very creative, they're very loud, and they're good. We're not as responsive as we should be to all this. We need to be quick, we need to be creative, and we need to challenge all this. Because at least in the MENA region, our part of the world, the atmosphere, as His Royal Highness Prince Al-Hassan said this morning, is toxic. There's a lot of hate speech, racism, anti-feminism, anti-women, anti-Christian, anti-whoever. So it's very serious, and we need to arm people with the skills they need to challenge all this and create content that is just as loud and just as creative. And so it's the project, the Media and Information Literacy in Jordan, has been extremely successful in addressing all these and providing the competencies and skills for teachers, in schools and universities and at youth centers. We started a national project that has been adopted by the government, and now I'm working with a team of experts to integrate it into schools, curricula from grades KG2 to grade 12 in Jordanian schools. And this is unprecedented in our part of the world. And I think it's important that we all support this effort and make all the knowledge available. We need to share. This is not just our project. It's something that is going to serve generations to come, and we can be a model for the region, and we can share the knowledge with the region. We were not able to do this without our partners, and I think partnerships with civil society organizations. We're a nonprofit organization, so civil society organizations, especially with Europe. Our first project was funded by the European Union, and then we got funding from DW Academy and the Dutch embassy, the Norwegian embassy in Jordan. So we're getting a lot of visibility and support and making this happen. And I think it's something that is just very critical. It's very critical that we provide that, and not just for the students, by the way. Mothers whose children were taking the course came up to us and said, we need to know what our children are doing, because we can see the difference it's making in their own approach to consuming media. And so they wanted, because that is also another thing that's happening in homes. Parents have a responsibility to guide their children through all this disinformation and the infodemic, as the World Health Organization called it.
Yeah, even I have a little follow-up question. I mean, it is wonderful. I mean, but how long will this take till it sinks into society? Because you just said that mothers are coming up to you. Because now you're starting, rightly so, with children in school. But disinformation, this polarization is taking probably youths and above.
Yes.
And how do you reach out to people who are not in school, like to the mothers, or to who goes and reaches out for his information in, let's say, funny kind of mosques or whatever? I mean, how do you reach out there, and how do you make an impact?
What we're doing is the national strategy is four themes. We're working with schools, youth centers, the media is also playing a role, and higher education, universities. So we're working at all levels on this. And what we did, we drafted, we produced manuals for training of trainers. So we're multiplying the trainers so they can, with target audiences, of course, with target groups. So we have trainers for youth. We're working with the Ministry of Education on the schools. And we're developing manuals for other. The media has been cooperative, but not enough. I think journalists have a huge role to play in this, and because we've seen a lot of violations in our own media organizations and by our own journalists who have become more obsessed with their egos and are basically becoming populists and undermining our profession. And so we have to be very careful how to address this, and they have to hold the responsibility of protecting. Because otherwise, I mean, if people misunderstand what journalism is and think this is how it is and this is how it should be, especially with self-censorship and a lot of control over media organizations, we will not get anywhere. It's important that people appreciate good journalism and support it, because we haven't been able to achieve it from the top bottom. We're going to try and do it from the bottom up and have people demand good journalism and the ability to express themselves and produce media content on their own.
Well, there you have a point. I mean, good journalism needs a space where it can evolve. It needs freedom, and it needs a space where it can freely evolve, because probably many who are victims of disinformation, they will say, well, this is good journalism.
Yeah.
And so that is extremely difficult, because, I mean, I do think that we journalists, I mean, the most valuable asset that we have is credibility.
Right.
And in many countries, we are close to losing it, and which is a huge problem and is linked with disinformation and this polarization that we're talking about. And I mean, we're all talking about this, and now this leads me to our last guest, Tamara Karoub from the Arab Center in Washington. Well, we all agree that disinformation is a new global tool that is extremely effective, of course, during conflicts. And as we see now, I mean, it is rather evident, especially with the war in Ukraine, because you see the two sides, it's very, very evident. And how does this rub off in the MENA region? Because, I mean, there you have got, one could call them proxy wars on disinformation on social media. What are the effects there, and what will trickle down?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. I would say they're not necessarily new tools. Disinformation and propaganda have always been used as instruments of war. What is new today, I think, is the scope, the scale, the easiness of dissemination that social media tools are affording disinformation and propaganda campaigns. And in the last decade, we've seen both state and non-state actors in the region investing in cyber capabilities, in strategies to use digital tools and social media tools to advance their agendas and influence populations both domestically and across borders. And I think in a way we're seeing kind of an era of cyber power as opposed to the traditional hard power or soft power that have dominated the last century or so. Russia, for example, has been engaged in disinformation and propaganda campaign in the region since before 2010, at least. And the goal of this campaign is to present itself as a positive power, as an anti-colonial, anti-West force that is ridding the region of US hegemony and, of course, to gain support for its policies, including its war on Ukraine. And we're seeing a little bit of success in that with public opinion supporting Putin and Russia in the region. I would say what makes disinformation and propaganda on social media powerful is that they are low-cost, high-impact operations. And they are almost invisible weapons, in a way, that many states and regimes can engage in to influence politics and to influence outcomes and conflicts across borders and influence foreign populations. If you look at the larger picture of great power competition, both Russia and China have been engaged in or investing in information and technological infrastructure across the region. And I think the long-term impacts of that cannot be underestimated, because information and technology are very important today and in the future. I would add maybe, just a couple of examples. We've seen, what Mark referred to as the digital superpowers in the region, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. They've been engaging in operations, disinformation campaigns to influence politics and conflicts across the region. UAE and Egypt used campaigns on social media to support the military regime in Sudan. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Russia, and Egypt carried out campaigns to support General Khalifa Haftar in Libya and even to attempt to overthrow the UN-backed government. And so we're seeing all of these across the region, not only by Russia or superpowers or wealthy regimes, but by anyone who has a stake, if you will. And those regimes are using social media to prop up dictators and entrench authoritarianism, exacerbate conflict, and the process undermining democratic principles and human rights. And I would just maybe end with one note that the issue of disinformation is only getting worse. It is a serious information crisis. Now with the advancement of technologies, we are seeing doctored images and deepfake videos are becoming more and more realistic. And part of these disinformation operations, particularly the ones that Russia uses, is to create this doubt and uncertainty where people are flooded with conflicting information and campaigns to the point that average users cannot distinguish fact from fiction. And this is going to become increasingly worse, where we're in a post-factual era. And it's a serious emergency, in my opinion, the information crisis that is quickly approaching.
Yeah, of course. And well, you come from the US, and there you have got an example also. I mean, the former president was once kicked out. I mean, before Elon Musk took over Twitter, he was kicked out from Twitter. So it is, I think the US is at a certain point taking it seriously. But my question is, how effective is a regulation? Like, for instance, yes, Trump was kicked out and others have also been kicked out. Now they have been readmitted, but it was that sort of, do you think that that is the effective answer to counter disinformation, or he just hopped on to other social medias and, well, is that the correct answer, or what could the correct answer be?
Yeah, so I mean, there's no easy answer, and there's no magic solution. Regulation is not picking up as much in the US as it is in the EU, but also there's a limitation to what laws can do. They have, obviously the question of jurisdiction. When we look at the Middle East and North Africa region, laws are being used by regimes to guarantee and ensure their survival, and criminalize opposition, and even disinformation laws and cyber crime laws to criminalize any opposition or criticism of their regimes. And so regulation alone is not enough, but also leaving it up to the social media platforms is obviously not a solution. They are profit-driven, and they are motivated by business interests. And if we look at the Middle East specifically, most of these companies have business relationships with the wealthy countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which they're considered to be hubs for technological companies. And so leaving things up to the social media companies has not worked. We have civil society organizations, and the ones that Bayan referred to, they do media literacy, they do research, fact-checking, campaigning, and so on. And they've been doing a bulk of the work, but they're underfunded and under-resourced, and they often face shutdowns and arrests and intimidation by regimes. And the last, I think, avenue that's been explored are multilateral or multinational mechanisms like the UN principles of business and human rights and so on, which are largely non-binding, but also they are by design bureaucratically and fiscally tied to governments, and they have to work within government frameworks. And so none of these alone is enough. I think what we need is a new model of cooperation that involves all relevant stakeholders, one that holds governments accountable, one that holds social media companies accountable, and one that supports and funds civil society organizations in doing the work, and most importantly, ones that support training and media literacy, because disinformation only works when people believe it.
Yeah.
And share it.
And share it.
And share it, yeah. Well, I think we have got time just for another quick round of questions and answers. I wanted to start again with Mark Owen-Johnston, picking up from what Tamara was saying. Accountability. Accountability has, two drawbacks. It is, let's say, presently linked to either governments or unions, like the European Union, by governments who abide by them. But what do you do, for instance, in the Middle Eastern regions? You're talking about Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, Qatar. I mean, what are the tools that are available to counter this, let's call it, occupation, one hand by the digital superpowers, on the other hand, it is a space that governments occupy to forward their own policies. And so that leaves users and, let's say, independent journalists very much pulling the shorter one. So what would you suggest?
I mean, in terms of solutions, you're asking the wrong person. I just deal with problems.
Okay.
But I think the question itself highlights a real problem. The fact is we're relying on these, or to some extent relying on social media technological platforms that exist or have been created in a totally different state, in a totally different milieu. And we're looking at a context where there's not much transparency, not much democratic government, and expecting there to be a reasonable way of combating this. And you know, Bayan mentioned one of the ways is to resource people who are trying to tackle this information, including journalism. That's a big part of it. But at the same time, I think you know, we have to expect more. I mean, the EU can do something, and what the EU does, for example, will impact on how these social media companies operate. But also, in a way, you have to, like, I don't know, lobby the countries in which these platforms exist. Like, you know, Twitter is based in the US, and US, as we know, is famous. It's a very neoliberal kind of country, regardless of which political party. They don't believe in regulation. Regulation is something that needs to happen. And there needs to be demands for transparency by people who are at least able to do that, say in the EU. For example, like obvious questions is, you know, I always talk about this with Alessandro. I mean, if you asked anyone here, how many content moderators does Facebook have that speak specific languages? It's not public information. Like at the very least, we should be expecting these companies to be telling us that, because these companies, these platforms are everywhere, and it's absurd. And we have this conversation again. I think we need to get away from this normative idea that the problem states are always the authoritarian states. Right? We talk about privacy and surveillance. We know, for example, from the Snowden revelations, what the US have done in terms of breaches of privacy. Yeah. But we also need to have a kind of critical eye on, for example, how these US companies are also being manipulated in ways that might be seen as beneficial to US interests. And I think this is another thing that we need to deal with. That's why we need to demand more in terms of regulation of these companies. I mean, one of the most active hashtags, I think, in the history of Twitter now is Masa Amini. You know, we saw more tweets on the Masa Amini hashtag in a month than we saw on Black Lives Matter over 8 years. And 25% of all the tweets on the Masa Amini hashtag have come from accounts that were created in a 10-day period. Now, as someone who studies Twitter manipulation, that to me looks like manipulation. But is this being ignored? One, because we can't there's no smoking gun to determine that this type of manipulation is actually happening. Because again, we don't necessarily have the tools. The companies are not transparent enough to provide us with that evidence. Or is it tacitly accepted? Because at the moment, as a foreign policy move, this is in line with, you know, what the US want. So we're not just dealing with this issue of living in a region where there's governments who are unable to cooperate and are unable to hold these companies to account. We also have to deal with the fact that there is an element that these companies operate with a certain degree of impunity and are inherently politicized. And I think this creates massive amounts of problems in how we try to tackle it. And again, when we look at disinformation, there are supply chains. There's a consumer and a producer. The platform is the medium. One of the biggest problems we've had in the Middle East, especially since 2017, is, for example, British companies in particular are some of the worst offenders, but the companies in Europe and Washington, they literally offer services that engage in deception. So Cambridge Analytica were operating in the Gulf. They were providing propaganda adverts, creating propaganda adverts. This was legal. One of the most famous ones, Bell Pottinger, a British lord, ran a company, and they nearly incited race riots in South Africa. Again, this was perfectly legal, right? So we need to actually also look at these supply chains. When we talk about tools and regulations, we need to actually also revisit some of the spaces where we can actually regulate to disrupt these processes that are ongoing, because it's in these supply chains that we have the problems. And again, going back to journalists, sometimes it's about not re-educating journalists, but retraining. One of the most scandalous or most outrageous disinformation operations I uncovered, which I always mention because it blows my mind to this day, is 2 years ago we found out like 48 different international publications had published over 100 op-eds written by journalists who did not exist, right? And these outlets, they included ones in Europe, New Europe, Spiked, also the US Washington Times, Newsmax. These were like, you know, actual publications, publishing things, but the content that was probably produced by a PR company working for a Gulf country. Right? And you know why? The fundamental problem in this whole link, editors did not Zoom with the person who was submitting the op-ed. They never even saw the person. They just relied on an email, a phone call, or a social media account. Right? So we talk about disinformation like it's a complex phenomenon, and it can be. But sometimes there are these basic little problems we have that aren't new, that we're actually overlooking. And part of the problem is content, this demand for content.
Oh, the presence of mass weapons in Iraq is the biggest disinformation campaign ever.
I know, but it's reframed as a mistake.
Well, that was also helped by the US government.
Of course, and it was promoted by US media. And,
yes, of course.
Well, don't forget also the Kuwaiti princess who gave the testimony for the previous Gulf
Yeah.
War that was coached by a PR company, Hills and Knowlton. So yeah, it's important to bear in mind too.
Well, wonderful. I mean, this leads us immediately to Alessandro and Europe. Okay, fine. I mean, how can we hold these digital superpowers accountable? I mean, for instance, I mean, it is, I don't know if it's true or if it's not, apparently Twitter, I mean, Elon Musk has been laying off loads of people and many have also gone on their own accord. So, I mean, who is watching over? I mean, is that the answer? Deregulation, like he's doing? And what are the difficulties and what are your worries regarding this?
So, as basically we all said, disinformation is a hugely and vastly complex problem that needs a complex solution. It needs a whole of society approach, it needs media literacy, it needs more funding for independent media. It needs also like a culture shift in how we see a journalist and credibility. The term fake news, which I hate, has made more damage than anything else because it basically put the blame on journalists when they were not part of the problem. So there are a lot of different things that need to be done. But if I could pick one that I would like to see implemented tomorrow, it's total transparency, as Mark was saying. It is insane that Mark was talking about, because we talked about it before, the human content moderator. So we know that Facebook, for example, has a tiering system to decide which countries are at risk of conflict and which countries can be affected where disinformation or manipulation of their platforms can lead to serious violence.
Happened in Sri Lanka, happened in
Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Ethiopia.
Yeah.
We know that, for example, Ethiopia was high on the list, not the highest. It ranks from 0 to 6. 0 was the US, because it's a huge market. 98% of investments are done in the US. Tier 1 is European countries and Brazil. So it was Italy at the time and Brazil. Tier 2, which is the maximum that a non-Western country can get to, was Ethiopia. And that was sometime in 2019. Now, this we know because of the leaks, of the Facebook leaks, of the whistleblower. But to this day, we don't know how many people have been hired, how much investment has been put in. We don't know how many posts have been taken down, what's the actual impact of things, what they're working with on the ground. Because even taking down content or deciding what constitutes a violation is an enormous complex matter. Because it needs to take into account linguistic issues, cultural issues, political issues, all of this. So it's a huge decision. And not even the
Governments
oversight.
are giving over to these digital superpowers a power which should not be their own.
Yeah, but then Meta, for example, the answer from Facebook was, oh, we'll create an oversight board that will look at what we're doing. I spoke to the oversight board about what Facebook is doing on Ethiopia. They don't have a number. They don't know how many people have been hired, how much it's been invested. These are multi-billion dollars companies that are investing very little. And when they tell you like, oh, what we're doing is that we're working with a civil society initiative in Jordan to organize 3 workshops. And that's how we fight disinformation. They need to invest and they need to be transparent. The problem is that if I could pick one thing, it's transparency. Because we know that Ethiopia was high on the list in 2019. We still don't know what's really happening, but we know that 3 years later, what should have been in place in 2019 is maybe in place now. What's the new Ethiopia? What's the new Myanmar? What's the new Sri Lanka? We don't know. It's not public information. We cannot even doing advocacy. And one of the issues is that priority on advocacy is driven by a Western agenda. The US is taking an actor-based approach to disinformation that is only looking at China, Russia, and Iran, because those are the 3 threats. Europe is taking a mixed approach between regions and actors, but all of the investments, civil society-wise, all the think tank initiatives, all the conferences are focusing on the actors that are part of the Western priorities. And there's no transparency. No one cares about what's happening in Kenya and the bot farms that actually link to this. Not talking even about the role, as Mark was saying, of PR companies in Europe and others who are profiting and are part of this huge deception chain, because it goes from lobbying to hacking. So it's a huge problem and it needs way more transparency.
Well, a real complex world that we have to face, and it's not easy. Bayan, I wanted to ask you, what are, according to you, the biggest dangers that we face, especially in the Jordanian society in the Middle East? What do you fear most?
I think it's mostly the fact that people have lost the filters. And in the past, journalists, we were called the gatekeepers because we were able to, give the information that is trusted, credible, and balanced, and wouldn't incite hate speech or racism in societies. So we were called the gatekeepers. Now the filters have fallen, and there are no gatekeepers. And we see a lot of hate online, and people feel free to do that under anonymous names the thing is, in Jordan, it's very funny, the main platform that spreads disinformation is actually WhatsApp. And people just, and you don't get to see the source of that piece of information. And also funny enough, I get a lot of messages from my friends who are highly educated and are well informed, asking me if this story is true or false, when it is obviously outrageously false. So people just need to stop and think. This is critical in our region. If only people would stop and think. Media and information literacy is based on asking the question. The problem in our societies is we were not allowed to ask questions. We grow up in schools, not because the schools are overcrowded, teachers don't have time for you to ask questions, and it's mostly a one-way traffic. We need to reinvent education, not just in Jordan or the Arab world, everywhere. Whatever we're doing is not working. And the information is available. The teacher should become just a facilitator, and students should be encouraged to look for the information, and that's where they become critical thinkers. Otherwise, this will not work. I think Finland is making huge steps in that regard, and they're taking that major leap in education.
I think our time is up. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, please. I don't know. Probably there is.
Yeah.
Could you just tell you who you...
I'm Joseph Carista. I'm a specialist of information societies. I work as an external expert of the European Commission. I belong to TAIEX group, and I also work for the Italian government.
A mic has come.
I'm Joseph Carista. I belong to the group, the European Commission group TAIEX. TAIEX is the Technical Assistance for Information Exchange. So I think I can share my experience saying that education sometimes is useless when we are not focused on the ABC of the information society. Struggling with the peak of the information is sometimes really hard because humans cannot win a battle against artificial intelligence algorithms, which are at the basis of all these digital architectures. So we should think about good hubs, information architectural hubs, like high-performance computers, to reach the speed of the propagation of information. So on the other side, we have a lot of fake news. Those are pushed by...
AI against AI, okay.
Not humans, right, not humans against AI.
Into science fiction, wait.
Yeah, so
who's gonna
AI
answer that?
against AI.
But this way, you're going all the way to another sphere. Human beings will continue to be human beings. We need to train them because
Correct.
this is going to become worse by the year or by the minute. And so we need to be as active against it by
Correct.
arming people.
Sorry, I have to stop you. We are already over time. AI is, well, that's time. That's one thing about humans. We live in time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mira.